There were 85 million casualties compared to 16 million. In terms of destruction, World War II was the worst war waged on Earth, but how was it so much deadlier than the previous World War? It's hard to imagine how many lives were lost between the two world wars. In both wars, it's important to know where the fighting took place. There were all the big European powers involved in World War I who dragged their colonies into fighting. It may be simple to label it Europe's Great War, but good old colonialism led to the inclusion of everyone. However, most of the fighting was fought in Europe. All of the war's most destructive battles occurred on the continent. I would also like to point out that there was an 11% chance for your life to be lost if you were a British soldier. Think about that. There has never been a time when the world was more interconnected when it was during World War II. By necessity, this meant that fighting had to be more global. Defeating major European powers no longer meant keeping the war within Europe. Even though much of the fighting still took place on the continent, in the late 1940s, Africa saw some fighting as the Axis tried to cut the Allies off from Middle Eastern and African oil. It is still possible to see rusted hulks of tanks and armored vehicles in northern Africa, all in an attempt to deprive the Allies of precious oil. There were more players than just Europeans in this world war. Japan comes a-knocking at the door. In addition, Japan was determined to dominate the Pacific Ocean, and this put it in direct conflict with the Allied forces. The region was still occupied by European powers that maintained lucrative colonies. A country like Japan has limited resources and depends on importing vital resources from other countries. With the outbreak of war in Europe, Japan had the opportunity to seize these lucrative colonies. The game plan was to establish the Empire of the Rising Sun over Asia and kick the West out of the Pacific. The Japanese had already invaded China, which was already preoccupied with its own problems in the midst of a bitter nationalist communist conflict. Despite their differences, both sides tried to repel the Japanese invaders. But the Japanese forces were better equipped and trained than the disorganized Chinese. Having been attacked and exploited by European powers for over a century prior, China was already humiliated and weakened. Even though China dwarfed Japan, it could not resist Imperial Japanese forces. A great deal of the raw materials and manufacturing power would come from China in order for Japan to succeed in becoming the roided-up country they desired to be. However, one Western power remained that could still pop Japan's balloon: the United States of America. Due to the importance of international trade in the Pacific, the United States had maintained a strong presence in the region for decades. Even though the United States is the fourth largest country in the world, it has always been ready to crush any opposing forces on the water. Considering its unique geographical location, it's the most important nation between the Atlantic and Pacific, serving as a point of balance between European and Asian powers. When the Second World War started, the United States Navy was competing with the mighty Royal Navy with the explicit purpose of keeping war at distance and far from home. There was a serious disruption in U.S. trade in the region because of Japanese expansionism. The relationship between the two powers was strained at best. Oil and industrial exports from the United States were also heavily relied upon by Japan. This status quo would always keep the US in control of Japan, keeping them on an oil leash. Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Imperial Japanese Navy on December 7, 1941, in an effort to prevent the US Navy from returning to the Pacific. Furthermore, by marching into the American-held Philippines, it aimed to block the US from counterattacking in the region. The Second World War had just been transformed by the addition of the Pacific Theater. This was the first truly global conflict, and fighting now raged across the globe. There were 25 million casualties in the Pacific alone, more than World War I total casualties. Among these casualties, only 6 million were from troops and 19 million were from civilians. It is estimated that Chinese and allies killed 1.2 million civilians in Japan during World War II. In the same way that Russia slaughters Ukrainian civilians in the Ukraine today, the Japanese Empire killed Chinese civilians for sport. the Japanese killed between 7 and 8 million Chinese civilians as the Japanese army turned killing into a contest. An estimated 200,000 Chinese civilians were killed in Nanjing alone over 6 weeks. Having an entirely different war going on at the same time in a different location skyrocketed the total casualties for the Second World War. However, technology would also make this the bloodiest conflict in human history. During World War I, most military commanders didn't quite understand how airplanes worked. They would use planes for observation missions that would provide important intel and information with a bird's eye view of the battlefield. Nevertheless, information is power, so soon both armies turned on each other and started shooting each other's planes down. It started by men using pistols to try and shoot each other down, and in true toxic masculinity style, it ended up with mounting machine guns on the planes. Airplanes, however, could also be used to directly attack enemy positions from the air, and while machine guns were great, to really make an impact on the front, you needed to destroy a lot of people, which involved some big bombs. The first aerial bombardment weapons were sharpened darts dropped from aircraft in large numbers over the front lines when plane engines were still relatively weak. If a soldier were hit by one of these sharp darts, the wound would be fatal, creating deep, wide wounds that were impossible to heal. Despite this, the darts were inaccurate and few of them actually found targets. If a dart missed, as most of them did, it really just made for a tripping hazard for the enemy. But imagine if you were that guy that was killed by a dart. You're out for a stroll, and the next thing you know, you look up and it's raining needles. Long story short, it started with dropping lawn darts from planes to aircraft like the Russian Ilya Muromets that could carry as much as 1,500 pounds of bombs. It was clear that airplanes would be the most important weapon in World War II. During World War II, Hitler's armies used fighter and bomber aircraft as part of their blitzkrieg or lightning warfare. The goal was to hit the enemy hard from the sky so ground forces could then come in and finish off any of their remaining stragglers. Airplanes proved to be so dominant that Japan was really sticking it to the United States Navy. This is because airplanes could transport huge bombs anywhere within the span of hundreds to thousands of miles. Multiply massive bombs by a ton of airplanes and you have cities being deleted from the face of the planet. In modern warfare, the accepted method is to engage enemy soldiers and destroy military and economic targets. To defeat enemy deliberately targeting civilian populations is no longer acceptable. In World War II, there was around 50 to 55 million civilian deaths, which was around twice as many deaths as there were for actual troops in the military that were fighting. The effectiveness of airplanes is a big reason for this statistic. During World War I, the artillery range was the limit of how far one could target an enemy. Since most of the fighting took place away from populated areas in World War I, the chance of artillery hitting civilians was low. However, in the Second World War, the true power of airplanes was discovered, and populated cities in any country could have thousands of pounds of bombs dropped on them from the sky. Incendiary bombs are bombs used to create firestorms, and the city of Dresden, Germany is a famous example of how much more deadly the weapons became. In 3 days, the city of Dresden was hit with 3,900 tons of explosives and the city was turned to rubble. Over 3 days, 25,000 civilians were killed, and this was just a typical Tuesday in World War II. While more civilians died in Europe, Japanese civilians were particularly vulnerable to air raids. In response to Japan's refusal to surrender, the Allies began planning an invasion of the Japanese islands. At this point in the war, unrestricted bombing was approved to help weaken the Japanese in hopes it would make them rethink and surrender. Initially, military and industrial targets were targeted by air raids. However, it did not take long for major Japanese industrial centers to get bombed to dust. When the United States noticed Japanese houses were usually made of wood instead of brick and mortar, they doubled down on using firebombs. This sparked massive firestorms around Japan, killing civilians in the masses. It didn't help that Japan had little to no infrastructure built for civilians to protect themselves from air raids. The Japanese firefighters were also not that greatly equipped or trained to handle the situations, allowing the burnings to go unchallenged. Everyone remembers the nuclear strikes, however, the amount of damage created by the firestorm air raids dwarfs the damage done by one bomb. The sky wasn't the only place where we saw technological advancements help lead to more casualties. In World War I, most troops moved primarily on foot. In World War II, tanks were used more heavily and vehicles to transport troops became even more important. Being able to cover ground faster meant more people were put at risk of coming into contact with the war. In World War I, Russia was defeated early and it was estimated that 8 to 10 million people were killed. In World War II, there were a staggering 40 million people killed on the Eastern Front, making it the deadliest theater in World War II. And in World War II, the Holocaust killed millions of people. The best known victims of the Holocaust are the Jewish people, who suffered between 5 and 6 million people. While the Jews suffered the most from the Nazi extermination efforts, they were far from the only population the Nazis killed in masses. Hitler wanted to wipe out the indigenous population completely so that Russia could be turned into one giant pure German colony. He ordered a whopping 5.7 million Soviet civilians be put to death, with many of them simply lined up and gunned down in vast rows. Approximately 270,000 disabled people were also killed by the Nazis. Political or religious ideology was also a reason for extermination, with as many as 200,000 Freemasons exterminated alongside up to 5,000 Jehovah's Witnesses. Hitler also targeted homosexuals, exterminating at least 25,000. And that is going to be the end of today's video, so don't forget, leave a like, comment, and subscribe.